Okay, here we go. All right, this is nicely blocking us, isn't it? Okay, so good morning. Our topic is Caribbean cuisine, Agency of Empire. Thank you very much for inviting us. I am Marcia Burrowes, and I am presently in Barbados. My co-host is Dr. Rita Pemberton, and she's presently in Trinidad. And here we go. We are a part of a collective called the Kanuku Collective, the Women's Collective. We represent countries from the north of the Caribbean as Jamaica to the south of the Caribbean, Suriname. We are a research collective. I'm remembering the time, so I'm going to move on. What we want to do in our presentation is challenge this construct that Caribbean food has a British pedigree. This has been published, that the foundation of Caribbean food is British. We are challenging this. We're saying that normally ethnoscapes tend to create myths and be built, and identities are built around these myths. And for us in the Caribbean, there's this constant myth of the strength of the British Empire. We want to remind all that there are several populations in the Caribbean. They're the indigenous populations who would have been here before the British came, then the enslaved and free Africans after the coming of the British, the Creoles who are combined, and the indentured Indians or the Indo-Caribbean peoples. We are particularly interested in giving focus to the plantation complex. If you know, for us in the empire, the West Indies became a space for the growth of sugar and the growth of tobacco and the growth of cotton and then the production of rum. We want to feature the enslaved women who were working on the culinary identities of everyone, not only the enslaved in the plantation, but the Europeans who found themselves here, these imperial persons who found themselves here having to live. We know that the British Empire, the British did try to reproduce whatever they grew in Britain and failed miserably because this is a tropical climate. We want to also ensure that you understand that for feeding the enslaved, they really didn't care about the quality of the food. They brought it from North Canada. They brought whatever was dried, whatever was salted. What then results is that European foodways, the practices of multi-course dishes, while African foodways, it's one pot. You do not have a kitchen, you're cooking in the backyard, you're cooking on the ground. And I'm seeing my friends from India and Pakistan nodding. Yes, that becomes us. And we work with pounded food as an African profession where example, you're pounding yam, you're pounding fufu, you're making things, you're putting in coconut. We also want to say, as we challenge this British pedigree, that there's stuff here in this region that empire came and found. There are turtles, there are games, there are various items that become a part of Caribbean cuisine, not necessarily brought in by the British. So we want to remind that in the African population, apparently we in the Caribbean have the highest population for those who are diabetic, because sugar and salt became the basis of Caribbean foods. The enslaved peoples were given sugar as an incentive, given rum as an incentive, given salt meat, you get the point, cheap stuff as an incentive to work or as a privilege, quote unquote. What we realize now, especially as we speak of reparations, there are populations who are heavily diabetic, who are affected by these foods. I also want to remind us that you have a creolization, a blending of cultures that will come, not only of the people's miscegenation, but of their food products. So therefore, the Creoles' food and culinary identifiers evolve as to what food are you known for eating. Your class and your food go together. And as happens with the empire, the closer to the Euro class or the Euro food, that may be perceived as the better class. I want to give focus to the indigenous peoples who were here. And the word cassava is an indigenous word. The construct of barbecue, boucan, is an indigenous practice. And of course, we spoke of this earlier in preparation. The potato comes from our region of the world. Yes, many were sent up to Ireland during the famine. The potato then became known as the Irish potato. I went to school in England. I have eaten fish and chips, but the potato comes from here. The Americans speak of Idaho potatoes as though Idaho has a claim on potato. No, the entire Americas has a claim on potato. Indo-Caribbean foodways, I want you to understand that after emancipation, Persons from India were brought in as indentured laborers. So these are not the populations that my colleague would speak of, who perhaps came in especially after World War II. So what we find is that with indentureship, these individuals are confined to their plantations, so they continue their food ways. Eventually, there's a mixture of ways, and we have marvelous foods which do not taste like some of the foods that we see coming out of Britain at the moment that my colleague would speak to. I then want to give focus to the World War II, because World War II is an important intervention in the narrative. It's the war. And the Ministry of Food in the UK is very concerned with about feeding its population. That's important. So for I am eating homegrown foods to beat the enemy. The intention is the enemy is beyond Britain. You're feeding the British populations. Not only in Britain, however, the 1942 exercise of Grow More Food was a British exercise, but went throughout the empire into the Caribbean. And take a quick look at these items. These are all things for baking. So really the focus of the British Empire here is the survival of the imperial presence in the British colonies, not even the Euro-Creole presence, those who lived here and descendants. These are persons, the professionals, the governor, his wife, the army, anyone who was here who found themselves wanting food. Because of the war, the food is not easily accessible. So you take the food such as the cassava that we spoke of earlier, which is indigenous, and the sweet potato, which is also indigenous, and you blend the culinary ways to create foods for the imperial presences, the persons who are here from empire. So biscuits are baked and donuts are baked and potatoes are glazed. This is for their populations. Consequently, when we come to this question of legacy of empire, I want us to give focus to what Professor Maureen Warner-Lewis calls the taxonomy of cooking. From the continent of Africa, whether West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, there is this taxonomy of stir and steam that continues today before the British presence and with the British presence. I want us to focus on this. This is the first Caribbean cookbook. It was published in 1968 by Rita Springer. We argue that this cookbook interrupts the narrative of empire. And recent editions show this image. And this is a perfect example of what we're speaking. The fish in the dish, it's a fish, it's flying fish, which can be found in Caribbean waters. We know that the indigenous peoples ate flying fish and highly possibly influenced the British when they came to eat the fish. It is a delicate fish. You really have to have the knowledge of how to bone the fish. And therefore, that's the passing on of culinary achievements. The indigenous people would have used for their bows and arrows, elements of the fish, like the hooks, etc. We know that the onions came from Britain. That is a part of the British culinary heritage. The sauces all over, the sauces from Africa, Caribbean sauces, Indian sauces, and the plating, well, this is, Corningware almost, but we know that the banana leaf was used during enslaved times. The fish would be fried and served on a banana leaf, and indeed sometimes sold. We want to end with this quote from George Lamin. His text, Castle of My Skin, has been reproduced in over 30 languages. Here he captures his memory of his mom. He's about to migrate from Barbados to Trinidad, and he will then migrate from Trinidad to Britain, where he spends most of his time and wrote so many books. He's here giving focus to cuckoo. Do you remember what I said about Professor Maureen Warner-Lewis and the taxonomy of cooking? This is the stirring method of cuckoo. You stir and you steam and you stir and you steam and you allow the thing to simmer, and the food is simmering. This is still done today in the 21st century, and I've visited friends in the diaspora in Britain, and this is still done. Consequently, we challenge this belief that Caribbean cuisine has a British pedigree. There are so many ethnic groups here that have contributed to Caribbean cuisine, but we do not deny that there are elements of the British cooking there. But what we're saying is, please revisit this narrative of what's the pedigree of Caribbean cuisine, and let's rewrite and not be dedicated to an imperial norm. Thank you.